There's a pain that burns deeper than betrayal. It's the silence that follows, not the peaceful kind, not the healing kind, but the hollow, echoing silence that feels like abandonment, the silence that doesn't just hurt, it questions. That makes you wonder, was I ever valued? Was I ever truly seen? Was I ever enough? This is the kind of silence that doesn't just close a door, it leaves it hanging open just enough to torment you. No explanation, no closure. Just absence and the heavy weight of what was left unsaid. You know this silence. It's the kind that whispers in the shower when you're finally alone with your thoughts. The kind that hijacks your imagination as you rehearse comeback speeches, ones you'll never send. It's the dream where they finally understand you, where they come running back with eyes full of regret, mouths full of apology, where you stand victorious, not just because they see your worth, but because you finally feel it too. But here's the cruel irony, they may never say a word, and you may never get that redemption arc you keep writing in your head, because life doesn't always give us clean endings. People don't always give us the apology we deserve. And pain doesn't always arrive in loud, visible ways. Sometimes it comes wearing silence like a mask, and it cuts the deepest. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed." But how do you choose not to be harmed by something that feels like it's erasing you? Here's how. By understanding that silence isn't always a reflection of your worth, it's often a reflection of their limitations. When someone betrays you and disappears, it feels like they've made a statement that you weren't enough, that your pain wasn't real, that your presence was disposable. But what if the silence wasn't an assertion of your unworthiness? What if it was a mirror showing you their inability to face accountability? Because accountability is loud, it requires courage, it requires ownership, it requires standing in the wreckage of what you caused and saying, "I did this." Not everyone can do that, not everyone is willing to do that. So when they fall silent, it's not always because they don't care. Sometimes it's because they can't face the discomfort of your truth. They can't meet the version of themselves that your pain exposes. But here's where your power returns. You don't need their words to validate your wound. You don't need their regret to prove your value. You don't need their redemption to write your peace. Because your healing was never supposed to be a performance they applaud. It was always supposed to be a transformation you own. Let's bring in the wisdom of Dr. Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor, clinical psychologist, and author of The Choice. She writes that trauma is not what happens to you. It's what lives inside you afterward, and healing doesn't come from those who hurt you, it comes from the meaning you make of what remains. She lost her family, her innocence, her freedom, but she chose to make meaning from that loss. She didn't wait for the universe to repay her pain with an apology. She turned her suffering into service. That's not forgetting, that's transcending. And that is precisely what the Stoics meant by building an untouchable inner life. Seneca taught that we must become immune to the chaos of others, not by isolating ourselves from pain, but by transforming how we relate to it. And this is the challenge we all face after betrayal. To not let the silence that follows shrink our self-worth, to not let the absence of remorse plant seeds of self-doubt, to not let their inability to love you teach you to unlove yourself, because here's the truth they never told you. The longer you wait for them to acknowledge your value, the longer you delay discovering it on your own. And that's the real tragedy, not that they left, but that their exit became a prison you stayed in, hoping they'd return with the key. But you were always the key. You are the only one who can look in the mirror and say, "This ends with me." This cycle of waiting, this obsession with justice, this fantasy of poetic revenge, this haunting silence. It ends when you decide that your peace is not up for negotiation, that your energy is no longer collateral for someone else's regret, that you are willing to grieve without being understood, that you are willing to rise even if no one cheers, because real healing is quiet. It's not a viral post. It's not a moment of recognition. It's the daily decision to stop tying your worth to someone else's silence. That's when you stop rehearsing comebacks. That's when the fantasy of revenge turns into the practice of rebuilding. That's when you stop waiting to be seen and start seeing yourself. And once you do, you'll no longer dream of making them regret losing you. Because you'll realize they already lost the best version of you the moment they chose silence over sincerity. And that version of you, the one who survived, evolved, and reclaimed your self-worth, they were never meant to witness it, because this glow-up, this rebirth, wasn't for them, it was always for you. Most people misunderstand what emotional mastery really means. They think it's about bottling up feelings. They think it's about smiling through betrayal. They think it's about pretending that pain doesn't exist, but that's not Stoicism. That's denial dressed in discipline. The Stoics didn't teach suppression, they taught integration. They didn't tell you to silence your suffering, they told you to study it, to befriend it, to transmute it, and that difference is everything. Suppression is force, integration is alchemy. You see, denial looks composed from the outside, but inside it's a pressure cooker. It's emotional tension masquerading as strength. The smile is tight, the breath is shallow. And the body holds on to every word unspoken, every tear withheld, every hurt unacknowledged. That's not mastery, that's fragility disguised as control. The Stoics weren't afraid of pain. They didn't flinch from grief, betrayal, or injustice. They welcomed adversity, not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they knew that inside every pain was a principle, a lesson, a mirror, Epictetus said. Difficulties show a person's character, so when trouble comes, think of yourself as being tested like a piece of gold. That's not suppression, that's confrontation. That's stepping into the emotional fire consciously, with the intent not to be burned, but to be refined. So what does real emotional mastery look like? It's not pretending you're unaffected. It's sitting with your feelings fully, but refusing to be ruled by them. It's naming your sadness without drowning in it. It's feeling anger arise and choosing not to weaponize it. It's admitting, this hurt me deeply, while still saying, but it will not define me. Mastery is not the absence of emotion. It's the ability to remain anchored as the emotion passes through. Think about the eye of a storm. The winds around it are violent, chaotic, destructive, but at the center, utter stillness. That's what the Stoics aimed for, not emotionlessness, but centeredness. This distinction is critical in today's world, especially for men and women raised to associate power with Stoicism, but only in the shallow, pop culture sense. The kind that says, don't cry, don't feel, don't show weakness. But real Stoicism, as Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, was about cultivating stillness, not stiffness. If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it, and it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now. He didn't say, ignore the pain. He said, understand it, and then choose your response. Let's use a real-life figure to illustrate this. Take Maya Angelou, a woman who endured unspeakable trauma, racism, and loss. She didn't bury her pain, she wrote it. She turned it into poetry, into advocacy, into art. Her emotional mastery wasn't silence, it was transformation. She didn't suppress, she transmuted. Her famous line captures the Stoic ethos perfectly. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. That's what it means to live with emotional mastery. You allow the full spectrum of human experience, but you choose not to collapse under it. You extract meaning from hardship without becoming its servant. And this brings us to a deeper point. Your emotions aren't the enemy, they're the invitation. Anxiety shows you where you're unprepared. Anger reveals where your boundaries are being violated. Grief uncovers the depth of your love and attachment. None of these are signs of failure. They're data, they're signals, but only if you're willing to listen without judgment. So many people make one of two mistakes. They either repress their emotions entirely until they erupt in destructive ways, or they let emotions run the show until they burn bridges, sabotage their peace, and blame others for their own reactions. Neither path leads to freedom, but the Stoic path, it threads the needle. It says, feel it all, but let nothing master you. Seneca warned against emotional indulgence just as much as he warned against emotional avoidance. He understood that both extremes weaken character. No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. So emotional mastery, then, is not cold indifference. It is warm vigilance. It is the quiet daily discipline of checking in with your inner life, of tending to your emotional landscape like a gardener, not yanking weeds out in rage, but studying the soil. Understanding what grows where, being intentional. This is why self-reflection matters, why solitude is sacred, why journaling, prayer, meditation, these ancient practices were recommended not as escapes but as excavations. They allow you to see yourself clearly so you can respond, not react. Because that's what Stoicism always returns to, not the elimination of emotion, but the elevation of response. And in a world that constantly pulls at your attention, your triggers, your fears, response is everything. So no, emotional mastery doesn't mean smiling when you want to scream. It doesn't mean biting your tongue until it bleeds. It means being still enough to notice the scream and then choosing to rise above it, not by ignoring it, but by learning from it, because your pain isn't the problem. Your reaction is where the freedom lies. And when you learn to feel deeply without being controlled, to hurt honestly without becoming bitter, to love fully without becoming dependent, then you are free. That is emotional mastery. Let's explore something most people never realize. The greatest punishment you can deliver isn't vengeance, it's your absence. Not just your physical absence, the kind where you unfollow or walk away. That's surface level. That's just the visible part of departure. The real withdrawal, the kind that pierces more deeply than any insult or retaliation, is when you remove your emotional accessibility. When you take your mind, your heart, your attention, your nervous system out of their reach, that's when the game ends. Because the truth is, most people who try to hurt you don't actually want you gone. They want you hooked. They want you emotionally responsive. They want to know that they still matter, because your reaction is the proof they need to feed their illusion of power. Whether it's guilt, shame, anger, defensiveness, or obsession, it keeps them tethered to you. Your emotional engagement becomes their validation. But when you go silent, not just with your voice, but with your nervous system, when your breath no longer shifts at the mention of their name, when your stomach no longer knots at the memory of their betrayal, that's when they lose all access. And let's be honest, this kind of absence can feel brutal to the one who is used to controlling your emotions. They expect you to lash out, to chase clarity, to beg for understanding. When you do none of that, they feel it in their bones. This is where Stoic indifference becomes a form of power, not cold, dismissive apathy, but disciplined non-reactivity. A level of mastery where you don't need to prove anything, because your very disinterest is the loudest answer. Marcus Aurelius captured this in his Meditations when he wrote, "Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed and you haven't been." That's more than just a clever line, that's a spiritual pivot. A shift from reactive ego to sovereign presence. Now let's take this into the real world. Consider the life of Nelson Mandela. He spent 27 years in prison under one of the most unjust systems of oppression the modern world has ever known. He was insulted, beaten, isolated, and dehumanized. And yet, when he was finally released, he didn't seek revenge. He didn't emerge looking to make others suffer the way he had. His absence, the absence of hatred, bitterness, and vindictive intent, shocked the world. It disarmed his enemies. It left oppressors stunned that he held no interest in retribution. He had transcended the entire emotional game they expected him to play. That is the power of absence, because real absence is not physical distance, it's energetic disconnection. It's when your thoughts no longer revolve around what they did. It's when your mood is no longer hijacked by old conversations, old messages, or imaginary comebacks. It's when you've reclaimed the steering wheel of your emotional state and they no longer get to reach in and grab it. Here's a truth you must internalize: if they can still cause chaos in your system from miles away, they're still in control, and you're still giving them access. This is where your discipline is tested, not just in staying silent, but in staying free. Because silence without emotional detachment is simply self-restraint, but silence with detachment, that's sovereignty. It's standing still while the old story tries to bait you in and choosing not to pick up the pen. It's remembering that you no longer live in that chapter. That version of you no longer exists. So what does this look like in everyday life? It's deleting the draft you wrote and never sending it. It's removing their number not out of spite, but because you don't need the option anymore. It's choosing not to rewatch the old videos or reread the old conversations looking for closure, because you've already decided that peace is closure. And perhaps most importantly, it's refusing to interpret their silence or activity as significant, because their existence no longer writes your meaning. The Stoics were clear. What disturbs us is not events themselves, but our judgment about them. Epictetus. You can stop the disturbance by removing your participation. Think of it this way: if your peace is a home, your nervous system is the front door. Every time you emotionally react, you're opening the door. Every time you ruminate, replay, revisit, you're letting them back in. But when you bolt that door, not with anger, but with clarity, they're left outside, not because you hate them, but because your healing no longer involves them. That's absence. And to someone who thrived on your attention, that's the deepest punishment of all. So no, you don't need to fight. You don't need to scheme. You don't even need to speak. You simply need to remove the access point, and then you keep building, quietly, powerfully, fully invested in a future they can't touch because it's no longer designed with them in mind. Let them wonder where you went. Let them notice your absence like a storm that never returned. Because when they can no longer reach your nervous system, you've already won. Let's speak plainly now, because this is where most people fall short. They begin the healing, they practice silence. They walk away from the battlefield of petty drama. They post nothing. They respond to no one. Their lips stay sealed. To the outside world, it looks like growth. But secretly they're still watching, still hoping, still checking if karma has kicked in yet. There's a part of them quietly refreshing the page, wondering if that person has started to unravel. Still wondering if that absence has been noticed, if their silence has been felt like thunder. They're not fighting anymore, but they haven't fully left the war either. They're playing a different game now, the quiet scoreboard. Do they regret it yet? Are they suffering the way I did? Do they finally realize what they lost? And let's be brutally honest, this isn't healing. This is emotional limbo. This is standing at the threshold of freedom while peeking through the window of revenge. And this is exactly the trap that the Stoics warned us about. Because the moment your peace depends on whether they are hurting, you're still tethered, you're still chained. You've just traded your sword for a stopwatch, waiting to see when the pain flips sides. Seneca wrote, "A good character, when established, is not easily overthrown." That's the character we're trying to build. The kind that no longer moves according to what others do or don't feel. Because let's be real, what if they never regret it? What if they never look back? What if karma takes 10 years or doesn't arrive at all? Do you stay suspended? Unhealed, unmoved, this is the bitter truth that most people can't face. Your healing must be completely detached from their suffering, not because they didn't do wrong, not because you're okay with what happened, but because your soul deserves more than to be stuck in that story. Let's take an example outside of Stoicism, but entirely in its spirit: Michelle Obama. When confronted with relentless criticism, racial attacks, and personal dehumanization during her time as First Lady, she had every opportunity to fight back publicly. To strike with words, to demand apology, to make it personal. Instead, she chose her now famous response: "When they go low, we go high." And she didn't just say it, she lived it. She stayed in her lane, built her initiatives, wrote her story, and let history do the rest. She didn't wait for karma to knock on their door. She built her own house on higher ground. This is the difference between power and performance. Power doesn't refresh the feed to see if the enemy has collapsed. Power stays rooted in what it's building. And when you live like that, when you finally stop watching the rearview mirror, you create something precious: indifference. But not the cold, dismissive kind, not the toxic brand of "I don't care" that people fake while secretly obsessing. No, this is sacred indifference, the kind that says, "I'm not waiting on your pain to validate my peace. I'm not here to witness your downfall, I'm here to build my rise. My joy is no longer contingent on your remorse." Because here's what happens when you're still watching them: they still own a piece of you. They still pull emotional strings. They still occupy mental real estate, and they don't even have to try. You gave it to them by continuing to measure your healing against their downfall. That's not justice, that's bondage. You may have left the argument, but you're still living inside their emotional shadow. And this is why the Stoics didn't merely walk away, they withdrew with finality. They didn't just stop responding, they stopped reacting internally. This isn't silence on the surface. This is detachment at the root, because silence without detachment is just performative. It's quiet resentment. It's the long, slow simmer of bitterness dressed in a calm face. But detachment, that's liberation. Detachment means you no longer care whether they miss you, admire you, or regret what they did, not out of spite, but because it's irrelevant to where you're going. You're building something now that doesn't need their collapse to validate your construction. You're not interested in their downfall anymore, you're interested in your elevation. And in that shift, something powerful is born. You stop reacting to the past and start responding to your purpose. You're not here to avenge your pain. You're here to transform it, not into vengeance, but into vision. And once you reach that stage, there's nothing left to monitor. You're not waiting, you're not hoping, you're not checking, you're living. They become background noise. A closed book on a forgotten shelf, not because you're suppressing anything, but because what you've built is so bright, their shadow can't touch it anymore. This is the true Stoic ideal, freedom from needing anything from those who wounded you. Peace not through their collapse, but through your clarity. So I ask you now, where in your life are you still watching the scoreboard? Whose collapse are you still waiting for? And more importantly, what would your life look like if you stopped watching? What would you have the time, energy, and emotional bandwidth to build if you let go completely? That's your next step. Because the truth is, when you finally stop hoping they're hurting, you begin to truly heal. You're not here to prove you've healed, you're here to be healed. That distinction changes everything. Because proving your healing is still a performance. It still revolves around them, the ones who hurt you, doubted you, or left you behind. It places your transformation in the court of public opinion, waiting for a verdict that never really matters. But being healed, that's sacred, that's internal, that's yours alone. The person who walks around needing others to witness their healing is still in chains, subtle ones, invisible ones, but chains nonetheless. Because if your progress is contingent on their applause, it isn't real freedom. It's just another form of dependency. This is the trap modern culture sets for us. It glorifies the glow up, the revenge body, the comeback post. Look what I've done without you. It all looks like growth. It feels like evolution, but often it's just ego in a different outfit, and the Stoics warned us against this very thing. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Ambition means tying your well-being to what other people say or do. Sanity means tying it to your own actions." So what are you tying your healing to? Because if it's still about being seen, validated, acknowledged, then you haven't actually left the battlefield. You've just put down your sword and picked up a stage light. This distinction matters more than ever in our age of hypervisibility. Every wound becomes a story, every story a reel, every reel an opportunity to win the narrative. But Stoicism asks a harder question. Do you need to win the narrative, or would you rather win your life? Let's take a real-world example. Think of Simone Biles, the most decorated gymnast in history. In the middle of the 2021 Olympics, at the peak of public scrutiny and expectation, she made a decision that shocked the world. She stepped down, not because she was incapable, not because she wasn't physically strong, but because she recognized that mental and emotional well-being was the real arena, that her health wasn't a performance, it was a priority. She didn't need to prove resilience by pushing through. She was resilient because she stepped away. That is what being healed looks like. It's choosing wholeness over optics. Presence over praise. It's refusing to tie your worth to applause, especially from the very crowd that would have cheered if you crumbled. Healing, true healing, is not linear. It's not sexy. It's often lonely, quiet, and slow, and that's why few people choose it. It doesn't come with fanfare, it doesn't trend, but it changes everything. It reorients your center of gravity from the outside in. When you begin to be healed, not perform it, everything simplifies. You no longer need to repost old texts to prove they were toxic. You no longer need to flaunt your accomplishments to make them regret. You no longer need to be seen rising, because the rising is its own reward. Here's what that sounds like in the soul. I'm at peace, and I don't need you to know that for it to be real. I've moved on, and I'm not looking back to check whether you've noticed. I no longer seek your apology because I've already given myself closure. That is power, quiet, steady, deep-rooted power, and that's what Marcus, Seneca, and Epictetus all wrote about in different words. Not the flashy kind of success that makes enemies jealous, but the internal victory that renders enemies irrelevant. Seneca said, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more who is poor." So too, it is not the person who has scars that remains broken. It is the one who craves validation to feel whole. You are not broken because you were betrayed. You are not weak because you feel pain. You are not lesser because healing is taking longer than you expected. But you remain stuck the moment you treat healing like a competition. The moment it becomes about speed or optics or revenge. Don't trade peace for proof. Don't let the desire to be noticed rob you of the chance to be free. Because here's the hidden cost of proving you've healed. You end up designing your life to provoke a reaction from people who no longer matter. You build in their direction, hoping they see you from the shadows. You pour time into constructing a life they'd envy instead of a life you love. That's not a future. That's just a delayed battlefield. But when you stop performing, when you stop needing their recognition to fuel your peace, a new energy enters your life. It's calm, it's clarity, it's true power, the kind that doesn't scream or flex. The kind that radiates, and in that stillness you'll find something you hadn't noticed before. You don't even want revenge anymore. Not because they didn't do you wrong, but because you're too focused on what's ahead to keep bowing to what's behind. That's the day you stop surviving and start living. That's the moment you begin to build a life that's not only untouchable, but undeniably yours. You don't need to wait for life to deliver justice. You need to rise in such a way that you no longer need it. Let's unpack something we rarely admit out loud. Deep down, many of us cling to pain because it gives us a script. A sense of identity, a narrative. They hurt you, so now you're the wounded one. You carry the scar as proof. But that identity can become a trap, because when the pain becomes your story, healing feels like erasure. Like you're letting them off the hook, so instead you hold on. You become the historian of your hurt. But the Stoics saw this trap for what it was, a slow erosion of self-respect. Marcus Aurelius warned that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. He didn't say, hold on until the world changes. He said, change the world within. Letting go doesn't mean it didn't matter. It means it no longer defines you. This is why real freedom begins not with revenge, but with redefinition. You decide what you carry. You decide what version of yourself you animate. You don't build a new life just to escape the past. You build it to become someone powerful enough that the past no longer fits. You outgrow it. Think about Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychologist. He lost everything: family, freedom, dignity. But in the darkest of places, he discovered the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. He didn't seek revenge, he chose meaning. He chose to rise not in spite of his suffering, but through it. That's the essence of Stoic resilience. We do not pretend the storm never came. We become the architect of a shelter so strong it cannot touch us anymore. So ask yourself, what if your healing no longer required their regret? What if the apology never came and you were okay with that? What if peace didn't require closure but decision? You don't need them to admit your worth. You need to start living like you already believe it. And here's the hard truth: the most evolved version of you has no time to be pitied, no room for bitterness. That version of you walks differently, stands differently. Doesn't need to be seen to be complete, because true power, the kind that rattles people without a single word, doesn't scream, it radiates. And in that silence, you no longer signal to the world, they hurt me. You signal, I've built something bigger than the wound. Let's take it one step further. When you stop participating in the cycles that broke you, you become dangerous, not to others, but to the systems of dysfunction that once fed on your energy. Your detachment is their drought, your elevation is their echo chamber, and your refusal to re-engage, that's your revolution. But don't confuse this with arrogance. This isn't about being better than them, it's about being better than you were when they had access to you. Think of the people in your life who have truly healed. You'll notice they don't talk about the ones who hurt them. They talk about books, their breathwork, their routines. They're not gossiping, they're building. They've traded the language of wounds for the grammar of wisdom. That's your next level. And the beauty is, you don't need permission to get there. No one has to say, you're free now. You choose to walk out of the emotional prison the moment you realize the door was never locked. Let me say that again for the part of you still waiting. The door was never locked. You were just holding it shut because it felt safer to stay angry than to face the silence of moving on. But if you can step into that silence, if you can stand in that stillness and not panic, something extraordinary happens. You begin to hear your own voice again, the one that says, we're not broken, we're just not going back. This is what Marcus meant when he wrote, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. Don't argue your value, be it. Don't explain your transformation, embody it. Because at some point, the smartest revenge is realizing you no longer want it. You just want peace. And peace, my friend, is not passive, it's earned. Through discipline, through silence, through walking away not weak but wise, not broken but rebuilt, not vindictive but victorious. Now you're not playing to prove anything, you're living to protect everything you've become. So now we arrive at the part few ever speak of, not because it lacks drama, but because it lacks audience. The part after the storm, not the fireworks of vindication, not the satisfaction of an enemy's downfall. No applause. No announcement, just peace, quiet, deep, absolute. You've made it through the rage, through the hunger for revenge, through the seductive fantasies of I'll show them. And now you stand on different ground, unchanged in the eyes of the world perhaps, but unrecognizably changed within. This is the ground where Stoicism lives, the terrain where your identity is no longer forged in what hurt you, but in how you chose to respond to that hurt. Because that's what makes someone untouchable, not being immune to pain, but being unmoved by provocation. Not cold but clear, not numb but discerning. Let's look again to Epictetus, who taught that freedom is found in choosing your response. You may fetter my leg, but not even Zeus has the power to break my freedom of choice. And therein lies the final, subtle victory of Stoicism, choosing a response so sovereign, so deeply rooted in virtue and purpose that the chaos around you simply passes through. Let us be clear. To build an untouchable life doesn't mean you never feel anger. It doesn't mean you deny your pain. It means you transcend them. It means you decide that your energy is too sacred to be spent on people whose chapter in your life has closed. You make peace more than a preference. It becomes your personal constitution. But here's where your next test begins. They might come back, not physically, sometimes not even directly, but in your memories, in your urges to prove something. In the late-night echoes of I wish I had said, this is when you'll be tempted to reopen the door, to retell the story, to analyze their behavior, to wish karma would hurry up and handle it. And it's in those moments, not during the argument, not during the betrayal, but afterwards, when you'll either elevate or regress. Because healing isn't a moment, it's a practice, a discipline. A decision you make again and again in silence with no witnesses. It is choosing stillness over storytelling. It's choosing to no longer audition for people who mistook your depth for weakness. It's choosing, finally, to live forward. Let me tell you a story of someone who embodied this, not a Stoic philosopher by name, but surely by spirit, Viktor Frankl. Imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, Frankl lost everything: his family, his career, his physical freedom. And yet he emerged with a radiant clarity. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That is Stoicism, not words on parchment, not quotes on a wall, but radical, embodied choice in the face of unimaginable injustice. Frankl's revenge, he built a life of contribution, healing, and psychological insight that the very architects of his suffering could never touch. That is what you're being called to do, not to punish, but to build something that renders their cruelty irrelevant. And now we come full circle. You began this journey with pain, maybe betrayal, maybe humiliation. Maybe a loss so profound that words never felt like enough, and yet here you are, still standing, still breathing, still capable of choosing what this pain will mean, because meaning is not found, it is forged in fire, in solitude. In stillness, and above all in the decision to stop giving old enemies new power. Let them wonder what happened to you. Let them scroll and not see your rage. Let them search and find silence. That silence, that's the fortress. That's what Stoicism gives you, a kind of armor that's invisible but unmistakable. Let's recall what Marcus Aurelius taught. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Not just different, unrecognizable. You don't need them to understand you, you need to understand yourself. You need to return home to your dignity, your clarity, your internal compass, and rebuild from there. And once you do, you'll see it clearly. You never needed closure. You never needed karma. You never even needed an apology. What you needed was the strength to become someone who no longer requires any of it to be whole. That is the smartest revenge. That is the untouchable life. So here's your final call, not to react, but to rise. Not to fantasize about justice, but to live it. in your schedule, in your posture, in your breath, in your relationships, in your relentless commitment to becoming the person that they, quite frankly, were never qualified to meet. Now I ask you, not as a viewer, but as a fellow traveler on this path of inner discipline, what are you still holding on to that no longer deserves space in your story? Drop it in the comments. Let it go not just in words, but in action. And if this journey spoke to your heart and sharpened your mind, subscribe to Unshakable Calm. Here we don't escape life, we face it with ancient wisdom and unshakable presence. Remember, the best revenge isn't silence for silence's sake. It's silence because your purpose is now louder than your pain. It's not a retreat. It's a return to power, to peace, to you.